All right, thanks everyone for joining us. Welcome to our FSU Libraries Office of Digital Research and Scholarship Immersive Scholarship Program, Photogrammetry Institute, event number 5. Quite a mouthful, but thank you all very much for joining us, those here in the room and those on Zoom. Today we got a great conversation set up. We have Dave Rodriguez, who is the Digital Services Librarian at FSU Libraries, working in our web development team, working on preservation, dissemination, and infrastructure build out for the libraries to service all of the scholars on the campus who are looking to work in digital means. We also have Dr. Michael Carrasco, who is currently the Associate Dean of Fine Arts in, is that correct? College of Fine Arts, who is also a researcher on Mayan and Mesoamerican art and theology, who's going to be talking about his aspects of working with photogrammetric and 3D modeling for research purposes. So what I'd like to do is sort of have them both come up. Dave will present first, and then Dr. Carrasco will present. And then we'll have a discussion sort of in the room and on Zoom, just to kind of ask about things that are important to think about when we think about the data necessary to capture, preserve, and then disseminate the work that we're doing, so that we have sort of a holistic understanding of the types of data that we're dealing with that may or may not be familiar or comfortable to folks working in the humanities and fine arts, where maybe this is more familiar to those in the hard sciences, but this is something that I think is interesting and vital to think about. So we'll have a bit of a conversation here. But first, I'd like to invite Dave Rodriguez up. He's going to give us a quick presentation on the types of work he's doing. So that's good. Cool. All right. Good. Thanks very much.
All right. So hi, everyone. So thanks for being here this morning. As I said, my name is Dave Rodriguez. I work at FSU Libraries, and today I'm going to talk to y'all about the challenges and complexities of preserving 3D objects for research and cultural heritage scholarship. It's going to be a fairly short slide deck, maybe 15, 20 minutes, as I'm really more interested in having a conversation with y'all about your work in this area. I will undoubtedly enhance my understanding of this part of the field that I am, full disclosure, pretty new to. There you go. First off, hi, hello, good morning, happy Friday before spring break. A little bit about me. I've been a librarian at FSU since 2018. Here's a nice picture of me standing in front of big rows of books, in case you forget what I look like or where I work. Before working here, my career was mostly focused in film and audiovisual preservation. I worked kind of all over the place. I worked in museums, I worked in other academic libraries, I worked in the private sector and nonprofits, kind of doing a little bit of everything. I managed a lot of physical collections. I did some commercial film work, and I, installed art in rich people's houses and all types of other stuff. But in my IT role here at FSU, I work mostly to maintain our digital preservation and access infrastructure and various web dev related things to that sort of as needed. And one project that I have worked on a non-insignificant amount of time on over the past few months or so is implementing a 3D object viewer into digital FSU Libraries Institutional Repository and Digital Library platform, and helping the library to improve our capacity to preserve and provide access to 3D digital collections in collaboration with folks like Matt and Amanda, which will take a closer look at that work specifically in a few more minutes. But let's kind of just dive right in. So to kind of get us started, I forgot I have two things going here. Oh. There you go. So to kind of get us started thinking about the work of preserving 3D collections, I want us to propose that we sort of keep these two ideas on this slide in our minds while we're sort of talking about this stuff, which I think on the surface may seem contradictory, but I would contend that they are in fact not. So one is that 3D objects are these wholly unique, complex scholarly outputs and case studies in digital preservation that sort of represent in some aspects new ways of having to think about preservation at the curatorial and the technological level. Fine, I'm on board with that, I buy it. At the same time, 3D objects are, at the end of the day, just packages of data. And these are subject to many of the same issues as any other sort of type of data, or to use that big F-word format that one is likely to find in cultural heritage collections and scientific collections, wherever you may go seeking them. And I would say that both of these are simultaneously true and require sort of equal consideration as we're sort of thinking through the issues at stake here. This just because from what I've sort of learned and what I've sort of gathered from my own work in this area, I think that if one was to kind of lean too far into either of these assumptions, you run the risk of one, making your work much harder than it could be, and two, missing some opportunities that are really presented by 3D objects, 3D formats to sort of leverage their really cool and interesting features to make our work more engaging and more interesting. So again, just sort of as we're thinking about this stuff, try to kind of hold these two things in your mind simultaneously. So another kind of thing to talk about before we dive into 3D stuff more specifically is sort of what we mean when we say digital preservation. And by we, I mean folks who sort of work in my field of libraries, archives, and cultural heritage preservation. And so when we talk about digital preservation, we are talking about a very specific, I think, industry type of term that has been extensively debated and fussed over and worked on for a few decades now, and carries a lot more significance, or one might even say carries a lot more sort of like baggage than what non-library or archives folk might initially grasp from just the term itself. So kind of speaking generally, you know, we live in a culture of convenience and historically unprecedented access to all sorts of resources. So if you are able to reasonably right now, as I'm talking to you, go and find something on the internet, you would understandably assume that that particular resource is preserved in the sense that you will probably be able to continue to access it through some means, through someone's responsibility, even if it takes like CSI level digital forensics work, you will be able to access that thing at least for the foreseeable future, if not for forever. But anyone who works in this field will tell you that, you know, there's quite a lot kind of inside of that assumption, and all of this kind of becomes a big can of worms really quickly. But in a nutshell, we can sort of think about digital preservation as kind of the sum of three parts: the sum of technology, organization, and resources. And this sort of three-legged stool concept that you see on the screen now first sort of emerged in about 2006 and is one kind of very common, well-circulated, and I think framing of digital preservation that holds up well and sort of looking at it from the sort of high level view. And so when we're talking about technology, of course, we're talking about the hardware and software that supports things like digitization workflows and the retention and dissemination of digital collections. It's computers and robots, right? The organizational aspects relate to the people, you know, the staff who sort of manage and operate that technology, who manage the physical collections, who set the scope and sort of mandate for the institution, all of sort of the admin and domain specific work that goes into making digital preservation sort of at the programmatic initiative level. And finally, the third and perhaps the most crucial leg of our stool is resources, or i.e. how much everything costs. And you know, how do we create a program that is sustainable? And you know, with our three-legged stool conception in mind, if any one of these three legs is weakened or is taken away, whole thing kind of falls apart. So in thinking about these three sort of foundations of a successful digital preservation program, a successful program is one wherein, for instance, like hardware and software tools of an organization have equal importance to like appropriate staffing and appropriate skills and training, and commitments to financial and resource stability. A very common sort of maxim you'll hear in this profession is that digital preservation is more than just selecting a suite of software or more than just selecting a set of standards, right? But it's really more about ongoing institutional commitment to supporting these standards and these systems. That's kind of where the rubber meets the road here. And this can be difficult to achieve for a lot of reasons, but the two big ones are, one, often these initiatives are grant funded, meaning that we don't have sustainable sources of resources, and two, that often organizational or technological aspects get kind of farmed out to third parties. This could be like a campus IT department, this could be an external vendor, which sometimes, not always, can cause issues for sustainability because these parties don't necessarily have the same interests or the same understandings of the needs of digital preservation as preservation professionals.
A major one of these being is that digital preservation is never really finished, right? Not unlike a lot of scholarly research and scholarly disciplines themselves, dealing with the technology and the organizational needs that are needed to preserve things requires us to sort of continually evolve and update our practices and infrastructure to meet the demands of an advancing society that is driven mostly by a capitalist marketplace. And at the end of the day, taking the long view of digital preservation is really about continually sort of moving our data around as opposed to fixing it in some final forever form. So finally, the last point that I'll make on this topic is that digitization on its own does not equal digital preservation. I make a point of this because I think this is like a very common misconception when it comes to this work. The act and the processes of digitization are, a very important first step, no question there. But it's really everything that comes after that, which really kind of makes or breaks the whole operation. And it's all this stuff that comes after that that we'll dive into now. So we could talk. So this kind of begs the question of how do we talk about any kind of data, whether it's 3D data, whether it's visual, whether it's tech-based, whatever, that is sort of like well preserved, at least for now, right? And just like the question of what is digital preservation, we could spend all the time we have today sort of talking about the various ways folks have created standards and models and assessment way and assessments for sort of all the different kinds of digital preservation programs out there. But that would be super useful for us and, take it from me, very boring. So I chose one, and I went with the FAIR Principles for Data Management and Stewardship, and these were first released back in 2016. And while the FAIR Principles were originally pertaining specifically to scientific data, these principles really extend, I would argue, to any kind of digital collection used for scholarly work, in addition to being nice and concise, and offers us, I think, a solid entry point to talking about digital preservation both in practice and in application. So the FAIR principles simply state that data should be fair, which is an acronym meaning it should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And at first blush, it may seem like these first two and these last two are kind of saying the same thing. However, there are important distinctions between all four here, which we'll talk about now. And I will qualify all of this by saying this is my sort of summation of these principles. If you want sort of a deeper dive into the nuts and bolts of all of this here, their website offers very thorough and very good. So, excuse me. When we're talking about findability really relates to how resources are described, what identifiers are associated with them, things like DOIs or other persistent IDs, and how they are exposed to indexing. By indexing, we mean things like search engine optimization and inclusion in other like aggregated type things like the Digital Public Library of America and exposure to various harvesting protocols and all of that. So in short, it addresses the question of how do people who want to use this resource discover where it is. If this thing is a house, does it have an address? Is it in the phone book? Can you look it up on Google Maps? If it's moved, do you have a forwarding address, right? Findability really relates to how accessibility, not the ADA kind, which is another very important part of digital stewardship, but a separate presentation. But when we're talking about accessibility in terms of FAIR, we're talking about how this relates to the availability and the stability of a resource. So, can it be connected to in a reliable way? Is the technical infrastructure in place that allows for the proper level of access for the right people? To continue our house analogy, is its foundation solid? Do all of its doors and windows work? Has it been swallowed by a sinkhole, and how do we dig it out if so? Which happens in Florida sometimes. Interoperability relates to compatibility with sort of different software and other types of data. So does the format of a resource only work with one type of software or one brand of software, right? Do certain features only work with one type of software? If so, how is this being documented? And how is that making the use of these resources easier? Relatedly, are there other formats that this data could potentially live in that would make it more interoperable than perhaps its native format, right? Is there a loss of functionality there? And interoperability is really one of these key issues for digital preservation that make that continual, that make that sort of necessary continual process of having to move data around go a little bit smoother. Finally, reusability is about how other scholars and researchers can reliably incorporate this resource into new work, not necessarily at the technical level, but pertaining to things like licensing and copyright information, provenance information, with all these different, with any type of resource. And in addition to this, the conformance with any domain-specific community standards of practice. All of this helps make sure that someone accessing this resource in the future knows where it came from and what they can do with it. So that's fair. So if the preservation work you're engaged in is kind of hitting these benchmarks, chances are you're doing something right. Again, this is just sort of one way of approaching these outcomes, but I think it provides, a helpful practical frame for talking about 3D objects more specifically, which we will do now. So we've gone through sort of what these sort of ideal outcomes of digital preservation programs are at the high level. Let's talk about how 3D objects make that work challenging and fun. So the fact that 3D scholarship spans so many different disciplines and so many different domains and carries equally varied methods of creation is really kind of the overarching issue. On this slide, you can see just a selection of these domains, and each of these carrying their own sort of eccentricities and esoteric needs with respect to their applications, how they need to be described, and what audiences they serve. In addition to this, 3D objects themselves can be really complex, right? One singular object can actually consist of a bunch of different sort files. You could have a mesh, you could have various skin and texture files, you could have things associated with movement and articulation, all that stuff, right? All these things sum together to create a complete 3D objects. And being able to store all these files together and keeping track of how they all work with one another can be a significant challenge for preservation. So because of this wide diversity, and sort of use cases and methods of creation, a major issue with 3D digital objects is that they lack interoperability and they have a lot of reliance on external dependencies. This is sort of a big problem through the lens of FAIR, right? If you do a simple online search, you can see just how many 3D file formats are out there in use right now, and many of them are proprietary, meaning that they are owned by usually for-profit entities who are less interested in you having long-term access to your data than they are in you continuing to use their products and give them money. And this isn't just isolated to things like format compatibility, but also other dependencies like reliance on specific hardware or various gaming engines, things like that. And this speaks to, so this kind of speaks to the current reality that there aren't really any universally accepted or preferred preservation formats for 3D objects. Many other data types we often find in digital collections like text, audio, video, images, what have you. For these formats, there are sort of preservation formats, which are usually open source, generally with lossless encoding, and are considered sort of well suited for long-term storage and access that don't rely on any one system or software to access them. The Library of Congress is, of course, one of the international leaders in sort of coming up with these sorts of recommendations and standards, and they haven't released anything for 3D objects, despite a lot of work in this area, in no small part due to all of these issues that we're sort of about. And then, of course, outside of the technical sphere, because not everything about preservation is necessarily about technology, questions about ownership are also increasingly important for libraries, archives, and museums, or the LAM sector. This sometimes manifests as a tension between, sort of the aspirations of these organizations to make their collections as open as possible, and the principles of the cultures to which those collections belong to. Sometimes this mission isn't always the ethically correct route to take. So in addition to that, there's always overarching concerns related to copyright, which of course isn't anything new in this line of work, but also just something we have to consider when we're looking at objects. Okay, so I've talked about how all this work is really hard and complicated, and maybe I've made you sad. a little bit. And if that's the case, I wanted to offer just some good practices kind of culled from the literature that we as practitioners, as scholars, as IT folks, as archivists, sort of working in this field can follow so we can really kind of more productively work together in stewarding our 3D collections into the future. And these are, of course, not exhaustive. So if you've encountered stuff that I have not listed here, I'd love to hear about it. And the first of these is really working with records managers and archivists early and often in doing this work. When preservation professionals are involved in the various stages of the data life cycle, it's much more likely that that work will meet those FAIR criteria than if practitioners and scholars just kind of bring us things completely after the fact. Institutes like this one are really good examples of that. So thanks, y'all. And really thinking about long-term preservation, not just once a project is done, but sort of iteratively throughout all of the phases of work, really does go a long way in this area. In this spirit, capturing as much information as possible about the creation process, this is called paradata usually, is also really helpful in ensuring that someone in the future, maybe using technology that we don't even know about yet, will be able to find access and reuse that data for new scholarship and so forth. Next, while you're working on stuff, test it in different environments if you are able to, outside of whatever you're sort of creating the thing in itself. Using platforms like Sketchfab or the Smithsonian's Voyager 3D Viewer, just to see how your models kind of behave out in the wild, can be really useful in troubleshooting and proactively addressing any preservation issues. And then finally, just preparing documentation, something like a README file. In addition to other references like screenshots or maybe short video files of sort of showing how a 3D object is supposed to look or behave, can be really helpful in making sure that archivists and future folks can reuse this material. And then, of course, also attaching any external references to files and transfer to the archive as well is really helpful if those dependencies exist too. So on this slide, I just copied a page out of ACRL's recent book-length treatment of this issue. If you are looking for a much more comprehensive dive into these issues than we can cover today, in addition to much more sort of granular, practical nuts and bolts exploration of these kinds of best practices, this is definitely a great place to start. There is a free open access PDF of the entire book on ACRL's website if you're interested, or you can buy a hard copy for some. So the last thing I'll talk about is what we are doing at FSU to support 3D scholarship through Digital, FSU's institutional repository and digital library platform. And as of last year, we've been able to stand up this this page you see here, which is sort of a proof of concept that incorporates an open source tool called the Online 3D Viewer into the architecture of Islandora, which is the platform that Digital is sort of built on. And the end game here is for Digital to have a full 3D ingest and interactive viewing capabilities so that faculty and researchers from FSU and FSU affiliated projects can submit 3D objects through a bespoke submission interface that we built, and then have those objects live and be accessible in Digital just like any other resource, like if it was a PDF or a audio file or anything like that. Essentially having this viewer live in the page for an object that a user can come in and interact with. This is slated for launch sometime in. So look out for announcements from the library related to that. And I also wanted to shout out Brian Brown, who is my colleague in web dev and the repository developer for the library, who did really the lion's share of the technical legwork and sort of grafting this open source tool into our open source stack. It required no small amount of pretty intense work and custom coding and sort of leveraging and making these things play nice with each other. So huge thanks to Brian for his Herculean work in this area. So that's it for me. Thanks again, y'all, for being here in person and on Zoom. I'm happy to share these slides if you're interested, if you want to see these links or anything like that. And yeah, looking forward to talking with y'all about this more.
Thanks so much, Dave. Carrasco, all that.
Thank you, Matt, and good morning, everyone, out there in Zoom land and the many people. And thank you, Dave. That's really inspiring to see. I know I got a little preview from our meetings with Matt, but it's really inspiring to see the viewer through the library.
Yeah, it works.
No, I've been forever. So I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe some of the trajectories that have led me into using photogrammetry and some of the challenges that I've had in distributing and preserving and thinking about these kinds of objects. And so I started off with something that actually doesn't have any photogrammetry in it, but was the starting point for my, well, the first formal starting point for my work in digital humanities, I guess you could say, and with issues that concern preservation and dissemination. That's the Temples of Palenque, which I developed as part of a team at Wesleyan University in the Learning Object Studio. And it was a dynamic website where we had content, but also had, we'd gotten a small grant from Adobe Systems when they had Atmosphere, and they were wanting to test out Atmosphere. And then right as we started, they shut down the Atmosphere project. And so we had built this model of the Temples of the Cross group in Maya, ironically, and then it was supposed to be worked into the Atmosphere system, but it wasn't. But anyway, we used it nonetheless, and we embedded in that model different links, and you could click on as a viewer in that environment to look at different components within the architecture, and that these different assets. So we also had panoramic views and still images and a number of different kinds of assets, and those were all aggregated into a dynamic map that you could go through and click on and drill into specific buildings, and then also click on those elements within to pull up those different kinds of assets. So that's the first experience of thinking about the idea of having different digital assets that you're curating within the context of this website in this case, but also the idea of how do you then deploy those different digital assets across a broad range of different scenarios. And this project, which we, at the time, where it was developed between 2004 and 2006, at the time we said it was going to be available forever. But of course, around 2017 or maybe 2015, there started to be problems for maintaining the architecture of the site and security issues with some of the programs, and some of them like Flash became problematic, and eventually it was shut down, I think in 2018, maybe a little bit earlier than that. So it doesn't exist anymore. So it exists as a file structure on my computer that I have a copy of. So now it's gone. I used to use it in classes. People used to write me out of the blue saying they were engaging with it. It was kind of a neat project. But now it's gone. And so that raises a lot of issues of how to keep things like this going, and what does it mean to work with that kind of material, where a lot of work went into that. That was probably one of the reasons I'm not a full professor now, is because I spent a lot of time working on that kind of thing instead of doing the work that was going to get me promoted for earlier and advance my career further. But I frankly think it's worth it, although I'm not advising that to anyone who is trying to do that. The next kind of situation that's similar to that was a project that I'm still engaged with, although not in the same formulation, which is the formative. I thought I had this slide, but the Mesoamerican the Mesoamerican corpus of formative period art and writing, I believe is the title, and that was a project that was initially funded with a planning grant, and then subsequently with a digital humanities startup grant, and that was to take basically create a digital catalog of formative period art in the Gulf Coast area and maybe a little bit more broadly. And use whenever we had the georeference information for the objects to then feed that into this map viewer that you could access through the web or through an app. And we were going to associate that with different kinds of metadata and different kind of formats of modalities of imaging, basically. So there could be historic photographs, or there could be we came to use reflectance transformation imaging technology, and so we could develop those. We never found a good dynamic viewer for that, and now I can't even run that software on my Mac, so I have to dig around to an old computer or get a PC and run it there. And at this time, we weren't using photogrammetry, but that would certainly be part of that. And we were in this project, we were working with Dennis Slice, and he was helping us to try to create basically a reverse image search. So you could go through the motifs that were on these objects and search for the motifs rather than relying on semantic metadata to do the searches. And this was kind of a test case for that idea, and we got a little bit into that, but we didn't have enough money, and we didn't have enough technical support to really do that. They're doing a similar project that's been more successful in Germany on Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions, where they're using machine vision and AI and I think based on edge detection software. I don't know if they still have ability for the machine to parse the components of glyphs, but it's something that's kind of an interesting proof of concept. We didn't get that far in this. We started collecting the data for that, this project, and we created with that overarching team, a beta version of the map interface and citing those objects within the map. And then we didn't get much farther than that, and that beta version didn't live very long here because I went one day to check it and it had disappeared. So I don't know even where it is in the FSU. It's in digital heaven. And this was before the library started to really have a robust support for these kinds of projects. And that's why it's so wonderful to hear about what's going on now. So as part of that project, what we did learn was some of the more, the techniques of image capture, or like a transformation reflection RTI and reflectance transformation imaging, and then photogrammetry. This is RTI, just to give a sense of some of the work we were doing to find, to provide different kinds of imaging to detect details that weren't originally detected. So in this case, the difference between one sign, kind of boring for people who aren't interested in that stuff, but pretty significant when this is the only example of that script system. But the most exciting thing, I think, for most people is 3D modeling of different Olmec objects. And so that's one of the colossal Olmec heads, a fairly recently discovered or excavated maze, alote, greenstone. It's not green, but it's been heated, so it's changed colors. And then imaging of various other objects are sometimes difficult to see. You see this in the museum, you don't see any of those details. So and you can't manipulate it in space. So this produces a lot of data. Each one of these, or it requires a lot of data to assemble these images, as Dave mentioned, that I think each one of these models probably is composed of about between 100 and 150 separate images. I've used a variety of cameras as I've been able to get better cameras, but I think now we're using a full format Canon camera that the department has, and we take the initial photographs in RAW and convert them to digital negatives. And we archive those as a separate file set, and then use Metashape as the program to assemble those into 3D objects. So it creates a lot of things to keep track of. I'm not a particularly organized person, but my colleague is much more organized, and we have those. We try to follow the best practices as laid out by cultural heritage imaging and other standards for capturing that paradata of when we're doing, how we're going about the process of recording that. But we're still left with these models that it's very difficult to know then how to integrate that into dissemination. So in some cases, working with FSU and a proof of concept for large format printers, we've used them in printing. This is at FAR from a number of years ago, printing a 1/4 scale Olmec head with among number 4. And then I've also worked with students in the art history program and others on scanning within MOPA's collection. So these are some objects from the Carter collection, ceramic effigy base, and then this gold object, thin gold object, which is really kind of an interesting, very successful scan considering the reflectivity of metal. So and these now live on MOPA's Sketchfab account, but hopefully will come soon to live on the library's account.
Test data.
Yeah.
So those are all ready to go.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the challenges that we face and that I'm facing in the project that we're now is a continuation that Mesoamerican corpus of formative period art and writing is that we have these objects and we have these digital assets, and we've been working with the University of Colorado Press to determine how to curate those within the context of a traditional print publication. So right now we're going to meet with the director of the press and the SAAs and at the end of the month and talk about, are we going to try to have these live somewhere and use QR codes in the book, and so the reader can pull them up, or some other format. But the idea is to, and what we proposed when we were writing our last grant report was that these objects, and this kind of aligns with what you were saying, so I'm glad what we made up kind of aligns with some of the best practices or practices that people are thinking about, is the different ways of curating these as individual objects. And the longevity really consists in placing them in different environments, and so that they can be reused. So that idea of reuse, and also providing access to those digital negatives, so that if someone wants to process those images in reality capture as opposed to Metashape, or when Metashape updates, it produces different results depending on the technology. So it's very important to have access to those original images and to make those available along with the model. The model is just one interpretation of a set of data that exists underneath it. And we also have felt it very important to try to tie that information also to historic images at the time of the excavation, so that people have a full breadth of the images that are associated with a given object, because sometimes at the time of excavation, the preservation of the original object was much better than it is now. So it's very interesting to see the kinds of, when you look at the history of the imaging of particular objects over the span of maybe 100 years in some cases, if you go back to those first images, some of the details are there. They've been forgotten and lost. And then they come out again in kind of a ghost way when you do higher resolution imaging, but you go back to the original ones and those details are there. So it's very important to not think that new imaging is necessarily a substitute for the historical work of digging through the historic record of different modalities of imaging when thinking about this. So I think that's, and then of course I want for our students to, I guess as a final thought on this, is for our students and our teaching in art history and kindred fields to be able to use this technology in the classroom in ways that bring students into having a more kind of tactile or dynamic experience with the object. So for architecture, it's always a complaint that, how can you experience space? Well, we can experience better in a 3D space, or hopefully in VR or XR or AR some kind of dynamic interaction. Vessels or sculpture, you know, you don't really have that sense of them until you're able to manipulate. So I think this is really finding ways of deploying. I think one of the greatest challenges for the learning environment, educational environment, is to find ways of deploying these objects within the classroom in an easier way than what we currently have. And I'll just end with that. Thank you so much.
I'd like to invite our panelists to come do the panel thing where we sit in front and ask questions. I'm gonna swap some stuff around on Zoom really quickly.
We have a question in the chat.
Yeah.
Marcelina, just wondering what formats does that read at FSU libraries?
Oh, God, I knew someone was there.
The answer is vague.
Yeah, we kind of built it, trying to be as format agnostic as possible. Basically, we have, I'm trying to think now, like when we designed the 3D object submission form, basically there's like 3 different kinds of files. Like you can ingest, you know, basically like your basic mesh and then various kinds of skins and textures and things like that. So I'm gonna get out of this and get ahead right now.
Sorry.
So yeah, so there's a lot. It's basically whatever is native to that 3D object viewer. We're not creating anything custom. We're taking one open source tool that's compatible with a lot of different 3D file formats and kind of grafting it onto another open source tool, which is digital, which is a cool thing that you could do with open source technology, but it's hard and complicated. So yeah, I can't rattle off a list of formats off the top of my head, but if you go online and you look at the 3D object, they're all in there. It's readily available. It's sort of the most, I think it's like the most common ones you think, like STL, PLY.
She said, does it allow for a README file submission?
So a README file submission would be like a separate sidecar file that you would include with an archival transfer that wouldn't necessarily be part of the 3D object itself. But usually when records get transferred to an archive, no matter what they are, you have like the thing itself, and then you have like a list of everything that's in said box, or you have, you know, other contextual information that usually gets sent in as part of any kind of acquisition. So that's basically taking the place of that. It's sort of extra information that we would want people to help provide to us in order to better understand and use all the information.
I think that's, you know, to Marcelina's point, I think that's something that Dave, you've had lots of experience with. Ionor is like ready to do already, with sort of having these like not the parent-child objects.
Yeah.
Sort of like
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you have a record of an object that can have multiple images of it, plus, you know,
Right, yeah, and something that Dr. Carrasco was saying that I thought was interesting is like, you know, it's this idea of, you know, like, so you have the 3D object, which is like a rendered thing that lives in a 3D object format that has been compiled from, you know, 150 images, you know, and like, if you could take those 150 images and, you know, pop them into Blender or in Maya or in many other different you know, sort of spaces in which to create a 3D object, like that is like the digital negative, like you're saying, that is like the original source thing that I think you would also want to hang on to as well, in addition to, you know, the finished PLY file or something like that. So yeah, so like I could definitely see, you know, objects in digital kind of being composed of several parts where we have, you know, the 3D object that you can interact with using the 3D object viewer, and then, you know, a big old zip archive of 150 images, like named sequentially, and then maybe a separate file about, you know, how they were composed originally and what other software like that. So yeah, I mean, all that's within the realm of possibility, and yeah, sort of like learning about keeping those source files. I think like that's a really interesting point that I honestly hadn't thought about. I was thinking about this.
Yeah. So I want to open up to questions here first. I have a list that I can chat with just the two of you about for hours, but please, yeah.
Just curious about the overall storage.
Yeah.
And would there be limits to contribute?
So we now, digital, everything runs in the cloud. Everything runs in Amazon Web Services. So theoretically, no, but practically, maybe. With respect to ingesting things, I think in the web form we have a file limit cap to like ingest through the form natively. I think it's like a gig, but that's just purely for bandwidth timeout related issues. Because if you try to upload anything like that from your home internet connection, chances are the connection is going to have itself out. Your thing is just going to spin and spin and spin, and you're going to get angry. But we do have alternative ways that if you say had like a huge amount of data that you need to upload, we could ingest that, kind of through some sort of like a backdoor. But as far as the capacity of digital is, we are now operating in Amazon Web Services, like so many other institutions. So we have the full capabilities of the cloud at our disposal. So theoretically, with enough money, we could store however much.
I think that'll be like a procedural thing rather than, or like a policy thing rather than a technological thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if it's, if you're someone that we've never heard from before, and you suddenly say like, hey, I have 10 terabytes of data that I want to give to you, we're going to have a conversation about that. But if it's, hey, I'm working on this project for the next 4 years, I will have 10 terabytes of data. We'll work out something and say like, okay, great, let's make a space for that. Let's think about how we're going to do that in effective ways. Deal with technological limitations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Make the budget requests and get more space allocated and that type of stuff.
Just kind of a side question on that, is the sponsored research allocated a certain amount of overhead to that feature? Because that seems like a great thing that they should do, because they're taking, like right now, I think it's
54, I believe.
it was 52 or 54 maybe, but I'm thinking like in total money from my current grant, it's maybe $40,000 or something like that. I'm in the same office. I don't have all that, and it would be nice if some of that money, and only 6,000 a year is going to, or 5,000 is going back to college. So it would be nice if some of that money were directed to a tool that I actually could really use.
I agree with you, and I'm glad we have this on recording on Zoom now. But yeah, I think that's a larger conversation that I think we've been fighting for a while. Not to get too inside baseball for like library budget negotiations and things like that, but a lot of the understanding of where grant overhead feeds back into the libraries is in the collection budget, and not a lot of these sort of like technical research support services that we're offering. And so that's obviously like an ongoing discussion. But yeah, I think it's the case that can be made for saying that we really ought to be getting help with that from infrastructural build out funds, the same way that new buildings or like keeping the lights on and that type of stuff. That story is easier to tell when we have a thing that directly supports research.
Yes.
And then the connection is a little bit more clearly made to the ones who do them kind of the first string. So that's a big, that's something that I'm interested in working on at sort of like high strategic levels. But that has not been answered just yet. So yeah, that's something we continue talking about.
Next year or 2 years, or the federal funded grants will have to have public dissemination.
Yes.
Or
Yeah, and that's been going on since about 2013
Yeah.
as well. So there's this sort of like rolling ball of more and more open data and open sharing requirements, and this newest Office of Science and Technology Policy memorandum that came out last year requiring all federally funded research projects to have their data publicly available. One of the big arguments that we have for continuing to support digital is that we have research that ought to be then made public, and there's a lot of non-served departments and institutions and disciplines that don't have a place to go. So archive is sort of physics, I believe, right? Arc, like with an X, arc.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's a bunch of like disciplinary ones for like physics and astrophysics and medicine and all this kind of stuff. But there isn't, as of yet, the institution or the disciplinary repository for history or art history or things like that. And that often falls to the institution. And then that institution needs to sort of find the same type of support that these other large places have. So yeah, that's an ongoing conversation. Lots of folks across the libraries are freaking so, and there's lots of
Question that is sort of very much related to that. Part of it is practical, part of it is philosophical. You have to both things. One is thinking about budgets. Talking about budgets. So as an archaeologist, you don't go in the field anymore. You have to go. Without having budgeted money and resources for conservation. You can pull stuff out of the ground and conserve it. But that's, of course, that's a big budget. It's an ongoing budget. It's well beyond years of the field. And so that makes things difficult. So one thing I'm asking, the practical, what kind of changes in budgeting strategies we're talking about? Figuring out how to fund these resources in the future. And then the philosophical question is one about how this is you guess, like how is this going to shape the way we do things? So for example, because it gets so expensive, one of the things that will happen is an increased reliance on survey work, which is much easier to have conservation issues. It's much easier to disseminate that data and so forth. But then this shapes the kind of questions we ask, it shapes the things we do. And so I'm just curious how these kinds of digital things that are arguing against them in any way. I'm just trying to imagine what that's going to do and shape them. So practical and how much should I start thinking about my team, but also like what's going to happen when we do this?
I have thoughts about that. Yeah.
Well, I just have, I mean, I don't know because I don't know how much it's going to cost us. But I guess one of the things when we first, like when Mary Cole was working on the Urban Origins project like, over 10 years ago now, we went too far and we went to have some discussion, and then later on we had some discussions for the initial steps that I showed here of our project to the library, and we really couldn't get an answer. There wasn't, how do we line item budget that the services that we were thinking of into the budget. And so I think that that's changed and now, but if there's a service that's being supported by overhead and sponsored research funds that where it's a building part of the university, that theoretically would clear up a lot of space on the digital side, because if you have to pay for storage, I mean, I don't know the rates are, but what is the one operated through the University of Arizona? It's a digital archive for archaeological data. A lot of people. TDAR.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's I don't know the cost, but it's not free.
It's free to use as a user,
But it's not free to deposit.
Correct.
And the only one that I knew that was free that was supported by Mellon was the ILA, which was the Indigenous Language Archive at UT, where you could deposit, but that was being covered from external funding and from private funds too. So if we have access to deposit material at FSU with some assurance of longevity, and not have to use one of those outside sources, I'd say it actually frees up a lot of money. But then that's a question of, should people be going to the library and saying, we want to do this? What's the bill?
Yeah.
Or is that something we can assume is going to be handled through something that they negotiate with sponsored research?
Yeah, and I think, again, that's a high level strategic conversation, but I think there's, as Dave kind of mentioned in his presentation, if you're thinking about doing that, ask that before you start to plan it. So if if you have a 7-year project and you come to us on year 8 and say, hey, we got all this stuff, how much is it going to cost me to do anything with it? And we say we don't have the infrastructure to do any of that because we chose to go in a different direction. And 8 years ago, that's everybody's going to have that time. So I think partially procedurally, talk to us early and often, and then we can start having those conversations on, well, we're getting X amount from overhead, from sponsored research. But if you're writing a grant for this, if you're asking for things that aren't normally included in the course of work, that's something that we could take on a piecemeal basis or something like that. I don't know, that may be a way to answer it. I don't have a straight answer for that necessarily. I think that's something that I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out because there are a lot of different funding methods and pricing methods for this type of stuff.
One thing that if I were to write a grant in the future, what I'd like to see is expanded so that you can build in georeferencing into the object and then have that populate a map.
Yeah.
In the context of digital or in some kind of build up on that. And that seems like would be a useful thing to even shape a grant around a component of that. Here's this much from this particular funding agency to be directed to the library to help build that out for public dissemination. And then here's how much we're going to allocate for the actual project. Because, in the NSF and NEH, they have that whole, for a number of those, they have that whole section for public dissemination. And I think, and that's even for those projects that have a primary project focus. And then of course, I think there's grants that would just fund that in itself.
Yeah. I think part of the question there is more of a philosophical question of approaching digital conservation works. If you approach a digital conservation work any differently than you would physical conservation work. And I think that leads us into some of the questions that I wanted to kind of get to you, but I'm going to just generally open it up. But thinking about you pull something out of the ground and you want to work on conserving it with best practices and then hosting it in a museum or a warehouse or something like that for preservation purposes. And then you make a digital copy of it, and that's the thing that you disseminate. Is that digital copy then being treated with the same care or conservation, thinking about all the technical construction, thinking about the documentation that you're doing to create this sort of sidecar paradata of all of this other type of stuff? Or is it, here's the real thing that we're going to hide away and make sure is not damaged, and then we create a digital copy that's the one that we kind of share out. That's the one that's seen by hundreds of thousands of times more people because it's now on the internet potentially and all this other type of stuff. Are you still preserving that and like offering the same level of care to that object as you would the physical object? Or does it just become the object of more convenience? So I don't know. You have thoughts on thinking about like,
I mean, we do the
sort of care.
I mean, we do the same thing with digital preservation too. Usually you have a preservation master, which is like the thing we would not put into digital because usually they're too big. We would put that into a separate digital preservation system, the system that we have in the library that we run is called Archivematica. And basically what the differences between those two systems are is basically, if you think of digital as sort of like the access platform, digital is like the storefront. It's like where you go to shop around and you can look at stuff. It's kind of made for user interaction. Whereas Archivematica is sort of like the warehouse, and you don't let people into the warehouse because the warehouse is kind of dangerous and weird, and you've got to know what you're looking and you've got to know what you're doing. Being in the warehouse, or you might break something, but the warehouse is good that it exists because it has like the authoritative final record of the thing. So for digital, that's so in thinking about the relationship between these two systems, like digital is really the access platform, and like if digital were to like burn down and there was some horrible thing that happened to it, yes, it is recoverable both in or just in terms of like how we host it, like because it's in the cloud, and that something awful happens and its original hosting site is no longer a viable place. It also lives, I think in Oregon as well. Basically, the digital lives either in Oregon or in Virginia. So if something happens in either one of those places, there's kind of backup. For Archivematica, it's the same thing, but Archivematica is really just about storage. There's no UI, there's no way for anyone in the public to get in there and look at stuff, and it's kind of meant that way. It's like
storage you would have in a museum, right? So it's kind of working the same way. It's just, when you're running a physical archive, you still have overhead, right? You still have HVAC, you still have all of the costs you have to space. It's just two different kind of storage environments that you have to maintain. Yeah, I don't know if that helps or anything, but that's it's interesting because like the methods of preservation have obviously changed, more in the past 50 years than they have in the past 500 years, but like it's still those same kind of levels and tiers of storage that we think about when we think about, like housing a film negative versus like a digital master, right? We both kind of keep them away. We only ever touch them to really, right?
That all is pretty good in parallels. And you're just wondering about the now are really taking these sorts of things. Yeah, is the ways in which it may change the work much the way that I'm waking up in this. Because you deal with Maya stuff, and realizing this deteriorated so badly, there's partly because there was realization.
That's a realization, I think that people, and like, that's why I sort of harp on the point is that like digital preservation is never finished. It's never like, okay, we preserved it.
That's the part that worries me.
It's gonna be, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And yes. Yeah.
And I think part of that is like doing as much as possible to contribute to shared allegations of institutions like libraries that are working on this type of thing, that when you contribute for your project, it's not that you are building your own archive and fronting all of that cost and then thinking the next 40 years that you need to support that. There are institutions that are like hoping to do this, that are looking to find sustainable ways of doing so. There's a risk there of like fragmentation of knowledge and understanding of a lot of these types of things, but I think that's where the conversations come in to say like, there's expertise in all sorts of areas, and I think academics are quite used to that, bringing in collaborators when expertise is required. And I think this is just sort of one of those aspects where there's a new expert at the table, or there's a new expert that should be called in to sit at that table. When you're thinking of, okay, yes, we need to conserve the physical, we also need to think about conserving the digital that we're producing for whatever reason we choose to do so.
There's a report by there's a group called Ithaca SR, that's sort of like this big group of researchers that look at all things and sort of pull out the archives, and came out with a report sort of mid last year that sort of did this really wide, took them a few years to write a sort of really wide survey of like what the digital preservation technological ecosystem looks like and like what all the various organizations are still doing. And their conclusion was basically like this kind of like shared responsibility model where like it's not just every library or every museum or every archive kind of running their own private data center and maintaining their own hardware and then finding ways to link it out and share it with everybody, but it's really this much larger system of like having things in the cloud and working with vendors, like working and it's really much more about these different layers of partnerships and different networks of partnerships as opposed to libraries and archives keeping all the technical infrastructure necessary. And it's interesting to see that because depending on the kind of institution you are and the size of the institution, your ability to participate in that is obviously still. But us being able to do things in the cloud, for instance, just we've moved digital into Amazon Web Services as of 2021, and even in this short time that we've been able to do this, like the capabilities of stuff that we've been able to do have been hugely increased. I mean, doing this 3D object viewer back when in our sort of previous hosting environment would have been impossible. So there are certainly opportunities, but I think it's getting people to see it as a long view thing, and like, no, you can't just throw like a 5-year grant in a different perspective. I think it's hard for administrators to understand sometimes, but it's all just a process of see change and having to change minds, and being really good things.
I think that kind of seems a lot, you know, I in a series of classes, I didn't really get develop and teach, but one of them was theorizing the virtual object in my mind, and then I had a prototype of that course that I had the students read Gregory Bateson's Apology of Mind, and there's one section where he's talking about information systems and redundancy within those systems. So if you don't have the redundancy in that, and the distribution of those materials also have to work through a kind of redundancy and duplication of the systems. And that, I mean, he's basing it on language where no one individual contains all of language. So like if all this information is existing in, it can't exist in one institution because the information as a dynamic entity and this system of information exists in the continual flow of those interactions between those different pieces. And I think that that's kind of an interesting way to think about, you know, these kinds of digital issues where it's even more problematic because it's not like a technology that's existed for 5 or 6 or 700 years of printing, where you printed something, you can distribute it in this form, and it exists as something that's a concrete object that can get burned, there's maybe another one that is not, and then it's lost. But you know, it has to be kind of constantly circulating in order to survive, just like our computer files from, you know, 20 years ago. It's you have to go through a real, if you haven't continually updated them, then it's harder to recover them. So I think that that's the biggest problem, because if you don't think about it in some kind of way like that, I don't know if that's the best way, then you know you are trying to build as an individual researcher your own archive. But how can you maintain that? There's no way to maintain that. And then how do you go to the library? Because the library, I mean, now maybe yes, but in like generally the library is doing this. So it's kind of at a frontier, I think, in a way of doing something that's been done with other modalities of information in the past, but needs to be applied again to a new kind of, or a different kind of information that is ephemeral in a certain way, or it's more quickly ephemeral than the other modes of information retaining are ephemeral, because of course all those other things are ephemeral too. But at least if Maya carves something in stone, it survives until it's obliterated. Not until the power goes off.
The preservation. Vision.
Yeah, that's a great one. I'm really interested in this concept of like, how do we deal with emulation as a form of, you know, so like you create, again, you witness this with your Adobe project from 2004 to 2006. Flash no longer exists, but it was a nice product that people were really interested in working on and developing because it was easy to use and it was powerful to create a lot of different things. And then there were reasons why it went away, and now nothing in Flash exists anymore because it's gone. And so you did all of this work, and then there's a innate requirement to sort of redo all of that work 5 to 10 years later, because there are issues with format preservation and things like that. And that kind of gets to your FAIR principles of thinking about, you know, not only which one this would be, I guess, interoperable, some combination of all of them, but thinking about, like, whose responsibility is that? You know, is it the project producers? You know, is it incumbent on you to then be making sure that your work is accurate every 5 years? Well, at that point, how many projects can you do before there is no more time, because you're just constantly updating a project from 20 years ago? Yeah, but then there's the other option of like, okay, well, how far in advance should one be really expecting interoperability? How far in advance should you be thinking about pre-planning for interoperability in the moment when there is a finite amount of resources that you have available to you? So if you have 5 years to work on a project, you spend the equivalent of 4 years of that time making sure that the 1 year of work that you did is going to last for the next 20 years, or do you do 5 years worth of work? You know, like there's a balance there thinking about, the file types that we're working at with for 3D objects now, we pick the ones that, based on our understanding, are the best ones that are most interoperable now. That will probably change in probably not as long of a time as we would really like, but it's something that we're going to have to be available to deal with. And who is in charge of that, I think, is a negotiation sort of at the level when that needs to happen. Oh, yeah.
I think emulation as a strategy, and like emulating software environments is definitely like one of the more cutting edge things that people are trying to do. It's this whole thing, emulation as a service, which like certain fancy like libraries like Yale and stuff have been sort of working on. Find it a lot in like digital artwork, where like a artist has created like some custom software, some custom coding environment to like control installation or something like that. So in addition to all of the physical pieces and all of the spatial aspects of installing a piece of art, there's also, you need to preserve like a Windows 98 operating system, in which to run this custom thing, right? So it's very tricky. You run into a lot of, understanding there's some rights issues because a lot of that stuff is proprietary. But you also hear like, I've heard several stories of researchers needing to run an old piece of software that needed some kind of dependency, and maybe it's like a smaller developer, and you just email them saying, "Hi, I'm so and so. I need to run this software," and they like send them the source code and say like, but I think those are the emulation is a whole other kind of wing of digital preservation. There's a lot of interest in, but it's just really hard to do. And you need a lot of knowledge, and you just need a lot of like infrastructure to be able to run virtual machines, just to offer them as a service for people. That's real things.
I think, in that front, that whole Palenque site experience was, felt like a waste, not a waste of time because it had a longevity in existence, but what I got from that was that if I focus on the like those pictures that I took at Palenque, the form portions of that are still legitimate. They still exist and I still use them. So if the focus for the researcher is on the development of the underlying assets, then those will have longevity that surpass any of their, however they're curated in a different format. And you can think of it the same way with a book. You're deploying the assets that you have or your thoughts at the moment, that configuration is published, and maybe 5 years later, you're 10 years later, you disagree with some aspect of that. But the pictures and the documents, the kind of fundamental data that you created can be redeployed in another configuration of what you think. And so that Palenque site, that could be reconfigured in different ways. Like the map still exists, and I didn't make the map, but that still exists, it's still valid, the images are still valid. The combination of how those things were composed there no longer supported. But, and I have no interest in going back and reworking that to make it work. But it can show up in an article, or it can show up in a book. I think the danger with that is for the research side, is that if you spend time doing that, especially junior faculty, how is that going to be measured in the P&P situation? And right now, the tools we are rewarding, we've created a system where we're undermining innovation because we're not rewarding people to take risks to develop things that will help advance our engagement with the visual world and with any number of different, not just visual, out of some kind of sense of longevity that is it fetishizes longevity and it fetishizes format. So until academia can break free of the genre of fetishism, then it's going to impede innovation. That's probably an unpopular view, but I hope people out there, there's other people listening who disagree with that.
I might ask a question. That it's not like setting a position, but it does seem to be you're arguing, and also thinking about the way you use the digital negatives and stuff for the data, and you create the model basically. Look at it, that's basically.
Well,
So-
I mean, yeah, there's a step, like, and that's changed, like, so where it took maybe 24 hours of running the computer to create some of those models 5 years ago, I can do in like 40 minutes now.
Yeah.
So there's a vast change in computation.
But still, for me, what it does is raise the questions, are these objects? Right, because you set out that was one of the ways of thinking of digital objects as objects. And a little bit of this, a lot has, and what since one. Is that actually true? Like they're processing objects. I'm arguing, I'm asking. I'm not stating that like I know.
So I will draw the analogy for you from film restoration, which I worked in for a number of years. You have the original camera negative, you have print, you have interpositives, you have various versions of the film that have been made throughout the course of its life. Maybe it's been edited for TV, maybe it's been moved into 16mm do print, maybe it's been dubbed in shorter languages. Like all of those things are different versions of the same thing, right? And I think to think about library terms, what's that? Ferber, yeah, right, where you do have like the work as it is, and then you have different sort of copies and editions and like manifestations of that same work, right? So I think with 3D objects, I think they sort of offer us a similar sort of view. Like you have the raw 120 images it took to make a scan something. Like sure, that's the original stuff that you used that was processed in order to create this 3D object. But the 3D object is actually the thing you're looking at, right? It's actually the thing that you're looking at. The negative of a film is the thing that went through the camera that was edited by a director that is the source of thing, but like no one is looking at the negative to watch that movie, right? Like so it's thinking about it in more like these are different parts of all of the same thing. That's how I
And I think also prioritizing the objectness of these things is also potentially something that's more particular to arts and humanities research. We're thinking about, like the procedure itself, the underlying data of a scientific experiment, the methodology and the process of the procedure are instrumental to understanding the output that is the basis of the article, the book, or the experimentation results, or something like that. All of that data and experimentation methodology is still vital to document and comprehend as part of university tenure, there's sort of like academic prestige and recognition events and things like that, which in no way discounts reapproaching that experiment 50 years later for like reproducibility purposes. And so thinking about the results of that as an object, the same way that we think of the results of photogrammetry run in 2011, based on the 120 photos that were taken and the technology at that time with computing power and the algorithms and the black boxes that we have available to us at that point, that object is a product of its time, yet we can run different things about or with different technologies at different times with that base data, yet the conclusions that were driven based on the original objects as an output of that set of data are the same way that we would approach, analyzing and reanalyzing a piece of work or something using different methodological lenses with new data and new information being presented to us over the course of the scholarly discourse, right? Like this is all, to my mind, part of the same methodology in terms of thinking critically about the things that we do and the ways in which we do them. Photogrammetry, 3D modeling, making 3D objects is just another output or manifestation of that process. But yeah, thinking about the object itself as the end all be all of that process, I think does a disservice to not only the object, but the procedure that's happening and all of the recorded data about the making of that thing, which may be more interesting when approaching it critically from a sort of surface level when you just kind of want to like take a glance at it. The object is way more convenient than running it yourself over 40 minutes of 4 days or whatever it is.
And then there's, you know, there's changes that, there's choices that you can make in that processing where you're gonna get more or less accuracy in that final model. So I think that, you know, that it's like, you know, you have the ingredients to bake a cake, but the cake is going to taste different than the individual ingredients, depending on what you're doing to it. But, you know, marking that process as a scholarly process, I think there's been a lot of attempts to do that. And, you know, like for the example that I, you know, heard presented a couple times, the Run Reborn, where, you know, they built into Bernie Fisher had talked about, you know, you can toggle between different reconstructions of different scholarly interpretations of a particular building and how it might look. And so there's citation built within that. So the construction of the model itself is an act of scholarly creation. And how is that marked, you know, as a scholarly production? That's the question. I think there's a lot of institutional and department difference between marking that activity. So I think in theory that if you create a model from data that's come out of research and you post it on Digimon, then that's in a sense a kind of publication of something, because maybe you got funding to go do the research. You have to take the pictures. You have to kind of decide what question, you know, how are you going to do that? What's its accuracy? And I mean, maybe it's not the same as how you might deploy it and writing it up in relation to other objects or how then you use it in other ways. But in a sense, it's kind of a collection and it's a presentation of data and it's a research activity. So I don't know how I think I haven't seen the systematic way in which that's being registered.
It's making me think too. I recall again from my days of working film and restoration. There was an instance where this was like in the early 2010. Someone was trying to do it. I'm assuming there was this plan to do this big restoration of Citizen Kane, also known as and basically they still had the really nice condition original camera negatives from Citizen Kane, and they're like, all right, yeah, we're gonna do like an 8K scan of the negative, and it's gonna look great. We're gonna be able to do all this new stuff with them. And they got this really high resolution of the scan of this film that was shot in 1940, and they were like, oh my god, you can see all the makeup, and you can see like all of the lines of like everything that was sort of hidden by like the photochemical processing that was happening at the time that would make the film prints, like everything kind of like softened it out of it. You didn't see, all of the creases and all of the lines and all of the makeup in the film was just annihilated, and it looked like shit. It looked terrible. So they had to basically go back and like de-res it so it wasn't so crisp and it wasn't so pristine. So I think that there is absolutely some merging. Like sometimes these older processes just work. Like you don't need to do the nice big high res new scan, because sometimes you see, or it's not going to fill out your, it's not going to complete, your purpose that you're trying to do. So
yeah, and I think it's like that comes up. I've seen, been looking a lot with like video game.
oh yeah, they do stuff with like video games.
Yeah, and so like there's a certain aspect of like there's artistic creation that takes in mind the materiality of the format that you're using. And so like a lot of these old things that we're using, old CRT monitors that had scan lines and pixels that were of a particular known size.
Yeah.
The artwork looks particular on those in a way that looks awful now when you're on like a 4K,
No, we had that experience. I curated the exhibit that's up in the museum now, and one of the artists was like, this was a work from 1999. He's like, you have to show this on a CRT monitor. It's going to look awful on an LCD flat panel. You have to show it on a CRT monitor. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Find the CRT monitor.
Yeah.
Rob Dewar knows what he's.
Oh, really?
Right, but we still got a couple of minutes. Are there any other questions on Zoom? Okay. Those on Zoom, we do welcome questions. You can unmute yourself too if you want to. We have the speakers all set up. requisite 7 seconds that we're supposed to wait for Zoom calls, so yeah. Yeah, you wait for 7 seconds of silence, and then you're like, all right, good enough. All right, well, I think rather than asking another question that I think would gladly take us over time, I'm gonna thank you both very much for being here. This has
Thank
been
you.
fantastic.
Thank you, everyone. Zoom.
I'm really excited to continue these conversations. This is hopefully round 1 of many of the Photogrammetry Institute. And so hopefully over the next coming academic years, we'll do more of this, bring in more folks from other departments and things like that. Thank you to my GA, Amanda Brito, who's working on this. Thank you again to Dr. Carrasco, Dave Rodriguez. Thank you to our participants in the audience and on Zoom. Still no questions. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Here's spring break.
Is